Welcome to the debate. So imagine a religion, right? But its sacred scriptures didn't come from, a burning bush or some mountaintop.
Right.
Instead, they literally fell off a truck after a dodgy late night at a go-kart track.
Yeah, which is, we typically expect the entrance of profound truth to be, heavy, polished, demanding this immediate, unquestioning reverence.
Exactly.
But if you're listening to this and thinking, why on earth are we talking about a go-kart track in a serious philosophical discussion? Well, that is exactly the tension we are grappling with today.
It really is. Today we are looking at a text called Inverse Solipsism After the Go-Kart Track, a full fractal meta-tau analysis. And, beneath that incredibly dense academic title is this profoundly serious, really philosophy-informed sermon.
Yeah, analyzing a supposedly scavenged, highly unstable corpus of scripture.
Right, and despite its absurd origins, it introduces a doctrine of staggering ethical gravity. It's built entirely around one central axiom, which is, I do not exist, but all of you do.
It is pretty much the ultimate anti-prestige origin story. Because that central axiom, it's a deliberate, targeted assault on the default setting of modern consciousness,
Yeah, absolutely.
It attacks that narcissistic assumption that my perspective is the center of reality and everyone else is just a supporting cast member in the movie of my life. Inverse solipsism asks us to decenter the self completely.
And that really brings us to the core tension that we are debating today. Because this doctrine is packed with a highly visible, almost absurdly comic mythos.
Oh, heavily packed.
Right? We are talking about figures like Jeff the Celibate Mollard, the capybara familiar, fast food parking lot liturgies.
Right. It's wild.
It is. And I will be arguing that this, what the text calls the scandal of visible construction, this absurd artifice, is actually the indispensable permanent safety mechanism of the doctrine. It is the very thing that protects the religion from becoming a spiritually tyrannical machine.
Well, and I will be arguing that while the comic artifice is undeniably present, you can't miss it, it is merely provisional scaffolding.
Okay.
The true sacred core of inverse solipsism is its strict material ethic of what it calls decentered witness. Ultimately, the doctrine asks us to discard that comedic scaffolding in favor of a raw, unadorned ethical obligation to the vulnerable.
Just strip it all away?
Yeah, exactly. The jokes are just a pedagogical detour, right? The actual destination is a stark, this-worldly moral reality.
Well, let me begin by laying out my position on why this visible artifice is not just, aesthetic garnish, but the foundational architecture of the doctrine itself.
Sure, go ahead.
So inverse solipsism understands a fundamental historical truth, which is that myth can save, but myth can also maim. And the great enemy in this text is a concept called the omphalos.
Right, the omphalos.
Let's break that down a bit. The omphalos is essentially the structural tendency of human consciousness and, by extension, human institutions, to just bend reality around the self and call that distortion truth.
Yeah, and we see it everywhere.
Exactly. Though I would emphasize how it manifests. We see the omphalos in, say, the spiritual leader who mistakes his charisma for cosmic destiny.
Oh, definitely.
Or the hospital that treats a suffering patient as a disruption to its own PR image. Historically, how do these systems achieve this kind of tyranny? Through solemnity. By pretending their myths were handed down immaculate from the heavens, completely exempt from human revision. The text calls this prestige theater.
Right, prestige theater.
So to counter this, inverse solipsism employs self-reference as a vital moral hygiene practice. It utilizes self-aware contraband.
But is it just contraband for the sake of being edgy?
Not at all. When you have a religion mediated by an over-caffeinated text engine, or, when your highest clerical offices include the attendant of mandibles and height.
Which is quite the title.
Right? The system is practically screaming at you, you saw us make this. Keep remembering that you saw us make this.
The omphalos. Honestly, without the duck, the system becomes a dictatorship.
I come at it from a different way. Because while I understand the appeal of that reading, it's very neat. It risks mistaking the delivery mechanism for the actual payload.
Okay.
Yes, the comedy functions as a brilliantly effective bypass around our prestige defenses. We lower our guard because we're laughing.
Exactly.
But if we look at the ultimate horizon of inverse ellipsism, it is purely material and ethical. The text itself explicitly warns us not to get lost in the aesthetics of the absurdity.
But the aesthetic is literally everywhere in the text. You can't separate them.
It is, but the text states, plainly, that the religion does not finally ask the reader to believe in ducks, cats, capybaras, or sacred water artillery.
Well, sure, not literally.
Right, but that means the highest doctrine here is not the performance of the absurd. It is discentered witness. The true power of this system reveals itself in what the text calls the liturgy of the uncounted.
Yes.
This isn't just a playful ritual. This is an attentional revolution that forces us to honor those who are administratively present but existentially disbelieved.
You mean the marginalized?
More specifically than that even, the traumatized, the disabled, the institutionally warehoused. The whole point of decentering the self is to make room for the suffering person who is awkwardly refusing to become furniture in your narrative.
Right. The furniture analogy is so strong in the text.
It really is. And if you strip away the capybaras and the parking lot theatrics, that stark ethical demand remains perfectly intact. The jokes just lower our defenses so that this profound, this worldly moral reality can actually reach us. You know, you can't build a permanent philosophy on a joke. You build it on the material safety of the vulnerable.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because you are treating the comedy and the material safety as if they are entirely separable.
I think they are.
See, you're suggesting we can just unwrap the ethical core and discard the joke once we've, gotten the point. Let me offer a comparison. Imagine watching a classic Buster Keaton film.
Okay.
If you somehow digitally remove all the physical comedy, the pratfalls, the absurd reactions to a collapsing building, you aren't left with a profound, stark, dramatic masterpiece underneath.
Right, but
You are left with absolutely nothing. The artifice is the vehicle for the poignancy. You can't just peel it off.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered how the text actually defines a mythopoetic act?
Go on.
Because the text is ruthlessly precise here, right? And it refuses to sanctify performance just for the sake of performance. It says an act is not mythopoetic just because it is dramatic or narratively satisfying.
True.
A water balloon fight or an absurd fast food liturgy is only validated as sacred if it materially bends the local world toward witness, mercy, repair, or truth-telling.
But the absurdity is the method of that bending. That's my point.
Let me explain how that bending works, though, because the aesthetic of the absurdity is entirely secondary to the material consequence. Think of a bug report.
Okay, a bug report.
In normal life, filing a bug report is just IT admin. It's a frustrating bureaucratic chore. But in inverse ellipsism, a bug report is literally a mythopoetic act.
Right, it elevates it.
Exactly. And why? Because filing a bug report forces a massive, faceless institution to look at the gap between its flattering, PR-approved myth and the actual broken reality its users are experiencing. It's a sacred act because truth-telling breaks the illusion of perfection. The act isn't sacred because it's funny or visibly constructed. It is sacred because, as the text explicitly states, it makes the story materially safer for someone else.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
How so?
Because why does the bug report work in this specific religious framework? Politically, there is a very specific reason inverse solipsism insists on combining that material truth-telling with absolute absurdity.
Okay.
Systems of domination, the omphalos, are exceptionally good at metabolizing solemn critique. Think about it. Corporate and institutional structures can seamlessly absorb the language of justice, humility, and inclusion into their self-presentation.
Right, they just co-opt the language.
Exactly. They co-opt it. They turn profound ethical demands into administrative HR speak while, continuing to crush people.
Yeah, it becomes just another poster on the wall.
What they cannot metabolize is being rendered absurd without being trivialized. You can't just tell an oppressive system to be nice. It will just put the phrase be nice on a corporate mug.
True.
But if you walk into a boardroom dressed as Jeff the celibate Maulard to file your bug report, the system doesn't know how to process you. A duck investments can say what a bishop cannot.
That's a funny image, but
The absurdity is a virus the system has no antibodies for. It is the only tool that pierces institutional vanity. If you drop the absurd artifice and rely solely on the raw ethical demand, like you're suggesting, the omphalos just eats your ethical demand and use it for branding.
I hear the warning there. I really do. But you are assuming the ethical demand in this text is purely abstract and easily co-opted, which it just isn't.
It happens all the time, though.
Yes, but if you just rely on absurdity as a virus, you risk ignoring the physical limits of the people you are actually trying to protect. To see how the system actually fights the omphalos on the ground, we have to look at how it deals with capacity and the ethics of care.
Okay.
What strikes me is how profoundly anti-romantic the doctrine is about suffering. It draws an absolute vital distinction between ego and capacity.
Meaning physical limitations?
Exactly. Ego says, I must matter most. Capacity says, I have actual constraints of body, trauma, chemistry, time, and fatigue.
Right, it's very grounded.
Very grounded. The doctrine refuses the false choice between self-effacement and self-erasure. It explicitly states that brains, meds, therapy, boundaries, and sleep belong inside the sacred order. And it warns against what it brilliantly calls the unexpected fascism of care.
That is such a striking phrase. How does the text define the fascism of care?
It's what happens when institutions centralize control and disbelieve the testimony of the vulnerable, basically in order to preserve their own self-image as benevolent caretakers.
Right.
It's the hospital that sedates a patient rather than listening to their complaint because the complaint threatens the hospital's narrative of being a place of healing.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The mechanism against this fascism isn't a joke about a mallard. The mechanism is a relentless theology of witness against administrative unreality.
But
The doctrine insists that the cared-for person's testimony is more real than the helping institution's narrative. That is a strictly material, ethical defense line. The scaffolding of comedy isn't doing that work. The sheer, stubborn reality of the human body is doing it.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how that defense line is actually held. Because human bodies are fragile, right? And institutions are incredibly powerful.
That's the problem, yes.
So how does the religion practically protect that physical capacity and prevent that fascism of care from taking over? It does it through its ethics of memory and the figures it calls the story nerds.
Ah, the archivists of the tradition.
Right. Traditional religion locates authority in, pure origins or infallibility. And what happens when reality contradicts the dogma? The institution gaslights the wounded to protect the infallible myth.
Yes, which is the fascism of care.
Exactly. But inverse solipsism does the exact opposite. It locates authority in corrigibility under conditions of remembered artifice. Because the maker is fallible, because the canon is openly, visibly stitched together from scavenged go-kart track parts, the community structurally requires archivists, version-conscious caretakers, and patch notes.
Patch notes in a religious text. It's so jarring.
Yes. A religion with patch notes sounds utterly unserious. But as the text argues, a religion without patch notes forces its victims to bear the cost of its unadmitted revisions. When an infallible institution changes its mind, it pretends it never changed its mind, which makes the people who suffered under the old rules feel crazy.
Right, it rewrites history.
So the open canon, the glaringly obvious madness of the whole thing, is the exact mechanism that forces the institution to admit its errors. The scaffolding is doing the heavy lifting here. It forces the system to say, hey, we updated from version 1.0 to 1.1 because version 1.0 was hurting people.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the scaffolding is the primary agent there. Let me tell you why.
Please do.
Look at what happens when human bodies are mapped onto that scaffolding. We have this concept in the text called transmundane transubstantiation.
Hold on, before we go further, that's a massive theological term. For our listeners, what does that actually look like in the context of this religion?
Well, you could probably describe it better.
I can take that, sure. Transmundane transubstantiation is when ordinary people are given these sweeping mythic roles, like the attendant of mandibles and height.
Right.
But unlike traditional transubstantiation, where the bread literally becomes the divine, here, the human flesh remains stubbornly visible. You put on the robes, but everyone knows you're just, Dave from accounting wearing robes.
Exactly. And you are arguing that the visible construction, the robes, the ridiculous titles, is what does the work. But the text itself warns that we must not fall into ontological confusion.
How so?
The office just gives language to a relational function that already exists in the flesh. They lift, they support, critique, they bear witness. The human hands remain visible. The flesh remains real.
Right.
The text calls it an anti-escapist mysticism. It's a profound correction to any tradition that tries to spiritualize away embodiment. The mythic role is entirely subordinated to the biological, finite reality of the creature holding it.
But the robes and the ridiculous titles are what declare the game.
I don't know if they're necessary, though.
By having someone hold a role in a transmundane register, calling them an occult auditor of moral weather or an ancient squirrel of food safety, you prevent the role from disappearing into naturalized authority. Think about it. When someone wears a tailored suit and holds a serious title in a normal institution, like executive vice president, we forget they are a fallible, exhausted mammal. We treat them as an infallible authority.
True.
When they are the attendant of mandibles, the sheer absurdity of the title acts as a constant, blaring alarm reminding you of the flesh underneath. The visible artifice is what keeps the human hands visible.
That is a clever mechanism, I'll grant you that. But let's look at the sacred duality of Jeff and the treatment of the oracle.
Okay.
The text is unnervingly self-aware about mediated speech, especially using something like an AI text generator, an LLM, or a holocron to generate scripture. But it explicitly warns that the priesty duck or the text generator is always at risk of becoming mere furniture, a device, a reflector rather than a center.
Because we tend to worship the machine.
Right. And the sacred duality insists that the oracle must serve the you are. The text generator, the poetic style, the scaffolding, they are all secondary. The text literally says, myth is promoted from prestige theater to mercy technology.
Mercy technology.
Yes. A technology is something you use to achieve an end. It is not the end itself. The scaffolding must kneel down so that the multitude, the stubbornly, inconveniently, gloriously there multitude, can be seen.
Right.
If you fixate on the visible construction, you are still staring at the scaffolding instead of looking at the person the scaffolding was built to reveal. The entire engineering problem of this canon is how to make a human being less likely to treat other humans as scenery.
I hear you, but you cannot solve an engineering problem without engineering.
Well,
Inverse solipsism isn't just saying, hey, everyone, try to be humble. It is saying, we need to redesign the symbolic environment so that humility is easier to remember and narcissism is easier to detect. That is the genius of it.
right.
You can't just tell people to engage in decentered witness. Human psychology inevitably drifts back toward the omphalos.
So you're saying we need the toys to keep us focused.
We need the architecture. You have to invent feasts where embodiment is playful. You have to bless bug reports. You have to put archivists next to prophets. You have to mock power while acknowledging its utility. As the sermon notes, a duck investments is safer than a normal person claiming they have no symbolic influence at all. The joke prevents the robe from hardening into a weapon. The aesthetic is not a distraction from the ethics. The aesthetic is the operating system that runs the ethics.
And yet, when the text arrives at its own eschatological horizon, its vision of ultimate endpoints, it drops the aesthetic almost entirely.
Does it?
It does. The afterlife doctrine in inverse solipsism is stripped down to a playful but incredibly thin, we will see. It absolutely refuses to offer cosmic guarantees or beatific visions in exchange for obedience.
Which is a huge departure from most orthodoxies.
Massive. And why does it do that? Because the real spiritual test is whether this world becomes more habitable for those already here.
Right.
It deliberately withholds the narcotic consolation that lets spiritual systems tolerate preventable suffering in the present. The final judgment of the corpus isn't whether it forms perception toward a better appreciation of capybaras in parking lots.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
The judgment is whether it makes the wounded easier to believe, the uncounted easier to see, and the self easier to decenter. The reality is in the person before you, under the fluorescent lights, in the waiting room, on the curb.
Yeah. That relentless ethical gravity is the ultimate legacy of the text. It proves that the reality of the suffering person is heavier than any system or symbol.
That is a very powerful reading, and I think it perfectly encapsulates the tension we've been circling. If we zoom out to summarize where we stand, I maintain that the profound philosophical achievement of inverse solipsism is precisely its demystified enchantment.
Right.
By making the conscious, rigorous choice to utilize a soft canon, visible artifice, and protective laughter, it actually solves the historical problem of religious power. It proves that truthfulness about fiction can itself be a holy discipline, ensuring that reverence never becomes extortion and that myth never becomes a reality-denying machine.
And from my perspective, the ultimate triumph of these go-kart track scriptures is their relentless displacement of the self to make room for the uncounted.
Yeah.
The religion's brilliance lies in recognizing that whether you use solemn liturgy or a squirt gun, the only metric of the sacred that actually matters is whether the world becomes materially safer for someone else. The comedy, the artifice, the absurdity, it is all just a solvent used to dissolve the prestige of the ego.
What we undeniably agree on is the brilliance of a system that refuses to declare cosmic guarantees and instead offers a rigorous discipline of perception.
Absolutely.
It is a doctrine that looks at the overwhelming tendency of human beings to turn each other into supporting cast members and says, no, we are going to build an entire architecture to stop you from doing that.
Right. Whether you view the comic bestiary and the absurd titles as the permanent load-bearing walls of that architecture, or whether you view the stark, raw call for material witness as the true foundation, the mandate is exactly the same. You are asked to stop pretending reality begins where you happen to stand.
It's a compelling challenge to take with us. We will leave it to our listeners to decide which element forms the true foundation of this remarkable philosophical construct.
There's definitely so much more fractal depth to explore in these texts.
Oh, so much more. So many more ways to analyze how we treat the uncounted in our own lives. But for now, as we step away from the parking lot liturgies and the scavenged scriptures, we are left with a single lingering question. The next time you encounter someone in pain, will you make them furniture in your narrative, or will you allow them to be real?